My father humiliated me in front of everyone at my sister's wedding, calling me the unemployed one. But no one expected the mayor to arrive and change everything in a heartbeat. Lydia Thompson stepped into the grand ballroom of the Manhattan Wedding Hall, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm golden glow on the hundreds of guests gathered to celebrate her sister Marilyn's big day. Everything looked perfect: lavish floral arrangements, crystal glasses, a live jazz band. But Lydia felt the familiar weight of dread settle in her chest. She had spent months trying to maintain a polite smile, hoping to escape her father's critical gaze. But it didn't take long before George Thompson, a man whose pride often overshadowed empathy, found her in the crowd. Raising his glass to deliver the toast, he paused and turned to Lydia with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And let's not forget Lydia," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Always here, even if she's well unemployed." A hush fell over the room. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Lydia's cheeks burned, hot shame crawling up her neck. Guests shifted awkwardly, unsure where to look. She wanted to disappear, to vanish through the cracks of the polished floor. Her sister's smile faltered, uncomfortable, but Marilyn didn't say a word. Lydia's mind raced. Every memory of favoritism, every dismissive comment her father had made over the years, flashed before her eyes. She had always been the quiet one, overlooked and underestimated. And now, in front of dozens of relatives, friends, and colleagues, George had made it official. He didn't respect her, and he wanted everyone else to know it too. The sting of betrayal was sharp, but amid the humiliation, something else stirred. A small ember of defiance. Lydia straightened her back, drew in a shaky breath, and resolved that this wouldn't define her. She would not remain powerless. If George thought he had broken her, he was about to learn that Lydia Thompson had only just begun to rise. Lydia slipped quietly away from the crowded ballroom, seeking refuge near the terrace doors where the winter air bit at her skin. The murmurs of shocked guests followed her like a shadow, and she could feel her father's prideful gaze burning into her back even from a distance. Every step she took echoed the years of quiet humiliation. The subtle digs, the comparisons to Marilyn, the constant reminder that she never measured up. For a long moment, Lydia just stood, staring out over the New York skyline, letting the cold wind clear her head. She replayed the moment in the hall. The way George had laughed, the way his words had silenced her, and the way the guests had exchanged awkward glances. It wasn't just the words, it was the intention behind them. George wanted to shame her, to make sure the world saw her as powerless, insignificant. And for the first time, she realized something she had buried deep for years. She would no longer let him dictate her worth. A tight ball of anger and hurt formed in her chest. She thought of Marilyn, her golden child, smiling proudly beside their father, the perfect daughter everyone adored. Lydia had always been the background, the other sister, the one who was quietly overlooked and dismissed. But the humiliation tonight sparked something different. A fierce determination, almost like a fire igniting inside her. She made a silent vow, one that would shape every decision from this moment onward. She would reclaim her dignity, her reputation, and her power. She would not be defined by her father's words, nor by the whispers of relatives. And someday, when karma played its hand, George and Marilyn would realize just how wrong they had been to underestimate Lydia Thompson. As the cold wind whipped her hair across her face, Lydia smiled faintly, the first spark of her carefully planned revenge flickering to life. The ballroom was still buzzing with awkward whispers when the doors suddenly swung open. Lydia barely noticed at first. Her mind was still tangled in humiliation and anger, but the sudden hush from the guests drew her attention. All eyes turned toward the entrance, and a tall, composed figure stepped in, exuding an aura of authority and calm. It was Mayor Robert Langston, the mayor of Brooklyn, known for his sharp intellect and impeccable poise. He was attending the wedding on behalf of a charity initiative that Lydia had volunteered with, though he had never met her family. His presence commanded attention immediately. People straightened their posture, and even George's smug expression faltered slightly. Robert's eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Lydia, he offered a small, discreet nod. A silent recognition of her, not her father. In that instant, Lydia felt a mix of relief and disbelief. Here was someone who saw her, who seemed to understand that she was not the person her father had tried to make her appear to be. George, unaware of the mayor's connection to Lydia, puffed out his chest and raised his glass once again, attempting to maintain dominance. But the dynamic had subtly shifted. Guests noticed Lydia's confidence rising just from this subtle acknowledgement. She felt a spark of hope, a sense that she wasn't entirely alone in the room. Robert approached her later, leaning in just enough to whisper. "Don't let them define you," he said quietly, his tone firm but encouraging. Lydia's heart quickened. This simple gesture was more than just kindness. It was validation, an unexpected spark that would soon become a powerful tool in her plan for redemption. For the first time that night, Lydia realized the humiliation might not be the end. It could be the beginning of something far greater. A carefully orchestrated revenge that would turn the tables on the very people who had tried to break her. After the initial shock of the mayor's arrival faded, Lydia found herself standing near the edge of the ballroom, her hands clenched tightly around her clutch. Her father, oblivious to the subtle shift in attention, continued to toast and boast, but Lydia no longer felt powerless. The whispered encouragement from Mayor Robert Langston still lingered in her mind. Moments later, Robert approached her again, this time with a genuine smile and a confident air. He didn't address George or Marilyn, only Lydia. "I couldn't help noticing," he said, lowering his voice so only she could hear, "how unfairly you were treated back there. You shouldn't let them define you." Lydia blinked, startled by the sincerity in his tone. She had always been invisible to her family, overlooked, mocked, and dismissed, but here was someone who actually saw her worth. Her chest swelled with a mix of relief, hope, and a new, simmering determination. Robert didn't just offer words, he offered insight. He asked about her skills, her ambitions, and the work she'd quietly accomplished over the years in volunteer programs and small personal ventures. Lydia realized how much potential she had been hiding. Not out of laziness, but because her father had never given her the room to shine. The conversation sparked an idea in her mind. If she could channel her anger and humiliation into strategic action, if she could quietly gather proof of her father's corruption and Marilyn's opportunism, she could turn this moment into more than a personal victory. She could reclaim her dignity publicly, even humiliate them in return, without stooping to petty retaliation. For the first time, Lydia understood that revenge didn't have to be reckless. With Robert's subtle guidance and her own careful planning, she could rise above the mockery and shame, orchestrating a transformation that would leave her father and sister powerless to stop her. In the days following the wedding, Lydia's humiliation festered into a quiet, burning determination. She couldn't forget the way her father had belittled her in front of everyone, nor the smug satisfaction on Marilyn's face as she watched. But instead of reacting impulsively, Lydia began to plan with precision. She would strike, not with anger, but with strategy. Lydia started by reviewing her father's business dealings, digging into the financial records she had access to from years of family connections. What she found confirmed her suspicions. George Thompson had been cutting corners, making shady deals, and hiding assets from both the law and family members. Meanwhile, Marilyn had been complicit, using her father's influence to maneuver her way into favorable partnerships while secretly betraying former associates. Rather than confront them immediately, Lydia began to document everything. Contracts, emails, receipts. Every shred of proof became ammunition for the moment when karma would take its course. She also revisited her own talents and accomplishments, compiling evidence of her volunteer work, personal projects, and the skills her father had always dismissed. Every late night spent organizing these documents, every careful phone call to discreet sources, reinforced Lydia's confidence. She no longer felt like the powerless, unemployed one. She was a storm building quietly, invisible to her father's watchful eyes but unstoppable in her intent. The first strike wouldn't be loud or reckless. It would be calculated, exposing the betrayal and hypocrisy she had endured while simultaneously establishing her own authority and competence. Lydia smiled to herself, knowing that when the time came, George and Marilyn would realize too late that the little sister they had mocked had been quietly orchestrating her victory all along. Lydia knew that raw anger wouldn't win this battle. Only careful planning could. With Mayor Robert Langston as an unexpected ally, she began turning her humiliation into a quiet but formidable power. Their conversations became more frequent, each one a careful strategy session disguised as casual discussion. Robert was impressed not only by her poise but also by her sharp mind, and he subtly offered guidance without ever exposing her intentions. Together, they mapped out ways for Lydia to demonstrate her worth publicly. She began accepting invitations to small business and charity events, showcasing her skills and leadership in ways that her father could neither control nor ignore. Robert introduced her to influential contacts, not revealing her connection to him initially, allowing Lydia's talent and charisma to speak for themselves. At the same time, Lydia continued her behind-the-scenes work, gathering proof of George's financial mismanagement and Marilyn's underhanded deals. Every document she collected, every secret she uncovered, became part of a growing arsenal she could deploy when the moment was right. She planned each step meticulously, ensuring that her eventual victory would be undeniable and public, leaving no room for her father or sister to save face. Even as she maneuvered, Lydia remained calm and composed in front of her family. George and Marilyn saw her only as the quiet, overlooked sister, unaware that their empire of control was quietly unraveling. The humiliation from the wedding had transformed into a powerful motivation, and Lydia thrived on the growing sense of agency. By the time she was ready to make her first public move, Lydia had shifted the balance of power. She was no longer the unemployed one whispered about at family gatherings. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her carefully crafted plan was already in motion, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Months after the wedding, Lydia's calculated efforts began to show visible results. She had quietly launched her own consulting and nonprofit initiative, focused on helping struggling families navigate financial hardships. The project was modest at first, but her leadership, intelligence, and genuine care for people quickly attracted attention. Volunteers spoke highly of her vision, and word spread through local media and community networks. George and Marilyn remained oblivious to the transformation. They continued flaunting their wealth and social status at events, assuming Lydia was still the same, unemployed one they had mocked. But everywhere Lydia went, whispers followed, not of shame, but of admiration. People who had once overlooked her were now seeking her advice, praising her integrity, and recognizing her competence. The turning point came at a prestigious family gala. Lydia was invited as a guest speaker to present her initiative's achievements. The moment she took the stage, the room fell silent. Her father's smug expression faltered as he watched his unimportant daughter command the attention of influential guests, philanthropists, and business leaders. The mayor, seated prominently in the audience, offered a subtle nod of approval. Lydia's speeches highlighted not only her accomplishments but also her unwavering dedication, painting a stark contrast to her father's reckless business dealings and Marilyn's opportunistic maneuvers. The crowd was captivated. Social power had quietly shifted from George and Marilyn to Lydia, and she didn't need to utter a single word of revenge. Karma was already in motion. Lydia left the stage with her head held high, a quiet, victorious smile on her face. The humiliation from her father's toast was no longer the defining moment. It was the spark that ignited a carefully orchestrated rise. And as she looked around, she could see the subtle signs of envy and regret in her father's eyes, the first hint that the scales of justice were balancing in her favor. The weeks following Lydia's gala appearance marked a subtle, but undeniable shift in the balance of power. George and Marilyn still believed they could maintain their facade of respectability, but Lydia had quietly prepared her first public strike. She had meticulously gathered evidence of her father's unethical business practices, hidden loans, misreported finances, and broken contracts. Marilyn's opportunistic betrayals, previously unnoticed, were also documented. Choosing the right moment, Lydia provided the compiled evidence to a trusted local journalist, ensuring that the story would reach the public without implicating herself directly. When the report was published, the headlines were unavoidable. Prominent local businessman under scrutiny, ethical concerns raised, and family betrayal uncovered in Brooklyn business circles. George's empire of influence wavered instantly. At first, George tried to dismiss the news with arrogance and denial, but the proof was overwhelming. Clients pulled contracts and business associates began to distance themselves. Marilyn, who had relied on her father's reputation to boost her own ventures, found her carefully constructed opportunities crumbling. Every deal she had sought to exploit for her advantage was suddenly in jeopardy. Meanwhile, Lydia remained calm and composed, her public image soaring. Invitations to speak, collaborate, and advise flooded in. The very people who had once whispered about her unemployed status were now praising her ingenuity and integrity. Her rise contrasted sharply with her father and sister's fall, and the humiliation they had inflicted on her began to rebound spectacularly. Lydia allowed herself a quiet smile each time she saw George fumble at a meeting or watched Marilyn struggle to salvage a failing partnership. Karma, she realized, was unfolding exactly as it should. The same people who had once mocked and betrayed her were now powerless to stop her ascent, and the revenge she had carefully orchestrated was proving far more satisfying than any immediate confrontation could have been. Months of careful planning and quiet strategy culminated in a moment Lydia had dreamed of for years. She had built her own successful consulting and nonprofit enterprise, earning recognition from influential circles, and even garnering the mayor's personal admiration. Invitations to speak at events, advisory boards, and charity galas filled her calendar. For the first time, Lydia felt truly seen, respected, and valued, something her father had refused to give her all her life. George, meanwhile, was faltering. The fallout from the public revelations of his mismanagement continued to plague him. Deals fell apart, reputations crumbled, and whispers of scandal followed him wherever he went. Marilyn, too, was struggling to regain footing, her opportunistic ventures collapsing as partners distanced themselves. Their attempts to save face in society were futile against the quiet, unstoppable rise of Lydia. Finally, Lydia decided it was time to confront her father directly. She requested a private meeting at the old family home, where George had once held all the power. Sitting across from him, she felt no fear, only calm resolve. "You've underestimated me for too long," she said firmly. "The world has finally seen what I've always been capable of, whether you acknowledge it or not." George's eyes widened, the weight of shame and disbelief settling on him. Lydia calmly revealed that she had reclaimed hidden assets and leveraged the legal and financial knowledge she had quietly amassed over the past year. Every corner of his empire he had assumed was untouchable had been carefully examined, documented, and in some cases exposed. For the first time, George experienced a taste of the humiliation he had so easily inflicted on his daughter. Lydia left the room with dignity, knowing her triumph was not just professional, it was deeply personal. She had finally achieved vindication, proving that betrayal and mockery could be overcome with resilience, intelligence, and patience. Despite George's growing humiliation and Lydia's rise, Marilyn refused to accept defeat. She had always thrived on manipulation and opportunism, and now she saw one last chance to undermine Lydia. At a high-profile charity event attended by the mayor, city council members, and key business leaders, Marilyn attempted to discredit Lydia publicly. She whispered false claims, suggesting Lydia had exaggerated her achievements and misused funds. Lydia, however, anticipated this move. Every shred of evidence she had painstakingly gathered, financial records, volunteer testimonials, and documented proof of Marilyn's prior betrayals, was ready. With calm precision, she addressed the audience, presenting the facts in a composed, confident tone. Each piece of evidence revealed Marilyn's dishonesty and opportunistic behavior. The council members and attendees leaned in, their attention captivated by Lydia's poise and clarity. Marilyn's face went pale as the crowd shifted their admiration entirely to Lydia. The whispers of doubt she had tried to plant dissolved instantly. Guests who had once looked down on Lydia now openly praised her integrity and intelligence. The power dynamic had completely flipped. Marilyn, who had long relied on her father's influence and her sister's overshadowing, now stood exposed and powerless. George, sitting nearby, finally understood the full magnitude of Lydia's triumph. The humiliation he had inflicted on his daughter was now mirrored back at him, multiplied by the public spectacle of Lydia's success. For Lydia, the satisfaction was profound but measured. She had orchestrated her victory with patience and strategy, not recklessness. In that moment, Lydia realized the true nature of revenge and karma. It doesn't have to be loud or vindictive. When executed with patience, intelligence, and integrity, it can be both devastating and just. Marilyn's betrayal had backfired spectacularly, cementing Lydia's rise and her ultimate triumph. After the charity event, Lydia finally allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had achieved what once seemed impossible: public respect, professional success, and the quiet dismantling of her father and sister's manipulative power. Yet, amid the victories, a deeper realization settled within her. This journey had been as much about inner strength as it was about revenge. She arranged a small, private gathering with her closest friends and mentors. Even in this intimate setting, Lydia couldn't help but think of her father and sister. George had apologized quietly after the charity event, shame written across his face, but Lydia had grown beyond seeking his validation. Marilyn, still struggling to rebuild her reputation, had no words to offer. For Lydia, their apologies and attempts at reconciliation no longer mattered. Lydia spoke quietly, almost to herself. Betrayal can wound, humiliation can sting, but neither defines who you are unless you let them. Her friends listened, sensing the quiet power that had grown from her pain. She realized that her revenge had been more than punishment. It had been justice served through resilience, intelligence, and integrity. The emotional sting of years of neglect and belittlement transformed into something far stronger: self-respect and personal empowerment. She understood that revenge wasn't about cruelty. It was about reclaiming control over the narrative that others tried to write for you. Lydia had done so with grace, precision, and moral clarity. In the quiet of that evening, Lydia finally felt at peace. She no longer carried the weight of shame or resentment. Instead, she carried the knowledge that her strength had reshaped her world. Karma had balanced the scales, but she had also done the work to rise above her circumstances, proving that dignity and resilience are far more powerful than fear or humiliation ever could be. Months later, Lydia stood in her newly opened office, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow over her achievements. Her consulting firm and nonprofit had become widely recognized, attracting clients and supporters who admired not only her business acumen but her unwavering integrity. Beside her stood Mayor Robert Langston, smiling with genuine pride. He had watched her rise from the shadows of humiliation to the forefront of the city's social and professional circles. George and Marilyn were no longer threats. They were powerless observers. The very people who had once laughed at Lydia, mocked her ambition, and dismissed her contributions were now forced to watch from afar. George had attempted to maintain his influence, but his past misdeeds had caught up to him. Marilyn's opportunism had crumbled under the weight of her sister's revelations and public integrity. Lydia's careful orchestration of events had left them with no defense, no authority, and no dignity. As Lydia walked through her office, she reflected on her journey. Every insult, every act of betrayal, had fueled her determination. She had transformed humiliation into strategy, pain into motivation, and anger into calculated action. The scales of justice had balanced themselves, not through malice, but through patience, intelligence, and unwavering self-belief. At a quiet moment, Lydia looked out at the city skyline, feeling a sense of closure and empowerment unlike anything she had known. The lessons were clear. Betrayal may wound, but it also teaches resilience. Humiliation may sting, but it can ignite a fire that cannot be extinguished. And above all, karma has a way of finding its path, especially when one is willing to act with intelligence, patience, and integrity. Lydia had risen, not just as a survivor of mockery and betrayal, but as a triumphant force, leaving her father and sister as powerless witnesses to the undeniable truth. The unemployed one was, in fact, unstoppable.